and this man, Alfred Rascon, came to the assembly, and they were talking about, they showed the video like this, and talking about him receiving a Medal of Honor, and one of my friends was, I believe it was his grandson, but they were related. His name was Alan Rascon, and funny story, he got expelled from my Christian school, but anyways, and it was for riding a skateboard, so that's kind of a cool story, riding a skateboard on school grounds, but that's not honoring authority. But I remember this. I didn't know all the details of it, but I remember I knew that he jumped on somebody to shield somebody from dying from a grenade explosion, and I remember being like, wow, that's such a honorable thing to do, and obviously he deserved the Medal of Honor. But what stands out to me now as an adult hearing that story, because I guess I heard that over 15, more than that, years ago, and so going back to that, I remembered it enough that I knew what to Google. I knew what to Google. I Googled Rascon Medal of Honor, and I haven't heard about this since I was in elementary school, but it stuck with me. But what stood out to me is this idea that what he got the Medal of Honor for was from the Vietnam War. And he didn't get the Medal of Honor until the year 2000. And you say, well, why would it take so long? Well, they said what happens is the people wrote him up, but the paperwork got lost. And so he didn't get the Medal of Honor for over 30 years after he did the honorable act. And so what that got me thinking about is this idea. We're in this series on honor, and today we're going to talk about honoring God. And so the question I had is, why does it seem like so many Christians have lost their paperwork on what God has done and failed to give God the honor that he is worthy of? Because Alfred Rascon was worthy of honor, but it took over 30 years for him to get the honor that he was deserving of. And so when I look around at the Christian populace, not necessarily our church, so let's just say the rest of the Christians, why is it that it looks like we have lost the paperwork on what God has done, and so as a result fail to give him the honor that he is worthy of? And so let me just make sure that we are aware and we are on the same page. God is worthy of our honor. Not because I say he's worthy of our honor, but because that's what the Bible says. So in Revelation chapter 4, verses 9 to 11, it says this. Show me the first slide. And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who is seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who is seated on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. They cast their crowns before the throne, saying, "Worthy are you, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created." It says he's worthy of receiving our honor because he is the creator. And so we may say Steve Jobs did a really good thing. I love my iPhone. He did a really good thing in designing the iPhone, but God did a great thing in creating Steve Jobs. And so we have to ask ourselves, if God is worthy of our honor, what does it look like to honor God? And we're going to see one way today that we honor God. But what I think it's important that we get this straight. Jesus in Matthew chapter 15 quotes Isaiah chapter 29, and he says, "These people, they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." And so Jesus isn't after lip service. He isn't after us saying, "Oh, we honor you," and all this stuff. No. Jesus wants our hearts to be close to him, and that to result in us living an honorable way before him. But we're going to talk about a concept that may make some of you uncomfortable. It didn't make Jesus uncomfortable, so it doesn't make me uncomfortable, but honoring God with our money. But there's other ways that we honor God as well. This is just the one we're going to focus on today. Let me show you another way. Maybe God will speak to you in this. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18 to 20 says this: "Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body." Maybe today the message you need to hear is not about money. Maybe you're already honoring God with your money. Maybe you need to consider other ways that God wants you to honor him, and maybe that way is with your body. And so the word here is glorify. In Greek it's doxazo, but it has a similar meaning to this word honor. It means that we adopt a way of thinking about our body, and we adopt a way of thinking about our money. And so what I find is that sex and money are the two ways that Christians struggle the most to honor God. And so today we're going to cover one of them. We'll cover the other one later. I think we talk about that plenty. But the text we're going to look at today is Proverbs chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. So I'll put it on the screen for you. It's very short. It's easy to memorize. It says, honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your income. It says that of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. Very short text. Very short text, but it's packed with meaning. And so the main point today is this. One way we honor God is by adopting his thinking about money. One way we honor God is by adopting his thinking about money. We saw in the first series on the first sermon on honor that we're supposed to honor our fathers and our mothers. So that means we adopt a way of thinking about our fathers and our mothers, and so we act accordingly. And then last week we talked about honoring civil authority, and so that means we think a certain way about civil authority. And today we learn to think a certain way about God, and we learn to think a certain way about God in relationship to us and relationship to our money. And so what the Bible teaches as a whole is that we're stewards, right? God is the owner, we're stewards. That means we're managers. So God gives us resources, and we are to manage those resources according to his ways. And so something I want to help you with today is maybe something that you may have been taught, or maybe not taught, but maybe you heard. You know what I'm talking about? Sometimes you try to teach your kids things, and you teach the right thing, but they hear it in the wrong way. And so one thing I want to confront today and maybe help you with is this idea that, well, 10% is God's and 90% is mine. That's not in the Bible. It's not in the Bible. That's something that you may have heard, and somebody may have said that to you, but they're wrong. 100% belongs to God, and so we use it accordingly. And we'll get into that this week. We'll get into that next week as well. But let's go back to Proverbs chapter 3 and dig in, starting in verse 9. Honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. And so let's be real. Produce, like the produce department at Wegmans, right? So produce is fruits and vegetables. And so we'll explain what that means. But a proverb is simply a wise saying. It's a wise saying, but it's not just any proverb, because there are all types of proverbs. These are sacred proverbs. These are proverbs that were given to King Solomon. When Solomon asked God to give him wisdom, God gives him wisdom. And so when Solomon writes to us in the book of Proverbs, what we are learning is not just some things that are wise. What we're learning is what God's will is for us and how we can walk in his will. And so the first thing we see, that what we're instructed to do is honor God with our wealth. And you may say, I ain't got no wealth. I ain't got no wealth. And so let me help you with this. In Hebrew, the word for wealth is hon. And it means you have enough to be comfortable. And so we could say, honor the Lord with your money if you have enough to buy a week's worth of groceries. And most people in this room have enough to buy a week's worth of groceries. We wouldn't call that wealthy. Well, then let's just not call this wealthy. Let's just call this our money. Because if you have enough to be comfortable, which most of us do, this text is speaking to you. The word is used in Proverbs chapter 13, verse 11. It says, wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it. Translation, if you win the lottery, what's going to happen is you may get $100 million, but what you're probably going to happen is you're going to quit your job, and you're just going to start seeing that balance go down and down and down and down and down. But if you learn how to adjust your life so that you can save some, that balance will go up and up and up and up and up, because you've adjusted your lifestyle. What's going to happen is you're going to adjust your lifestyle to winning the lottery, and you're going to spend all the money, and what you find is all these people that have all this money, athletes, all these things, end up bankrupt, even though you would think that shouldn't be the case. But it happens enough that I wouldn't assume that if it happened to me, I would do anything differently. So the first thing I want you to see today is this. We show what we value by how we use our money. We show what we value by how we use our money. It's been said by many people that you can look at a person's bank account and find out what's important to them. And I could make a bolder statement that I should be able to look at your bank statement and find out whether or not you're a Christian by how you're using your money. You know, if you looked at Katie and my bank statement recently, what you'd find is this fall, there were two really big expenses: a mortgage and tuition. Thousands of dollars were spent on a mortgage and tuition this fall. And so you may be of the mindset that going to college or going back for a graduate degree is a waste of money. And you'd be like, why would you spend thousands of dollars getting degrees? That's because you don't value that. We value that, so we're willing to put our money towards that. You can see it in different ways. So this is just me, right? Not saying this is prescriptive for you. Description of my life since I've started working. I've never had a car payment because I don't think it's a good use of my money, but I'm willing to spend a car payment to go to a football game, right? I value that. I value that experience. That's only going to happen one time, right? Cowboys fan. Cowboys come to play the Redskins. Only once a year. I think it's important for me to go to that game for the rest of my life. I value that. I don't honor it above God. I don't value it above God. I don't spend more on going to a game than I'll give to the Lord. But I think it's important. But I don't think it's important to have a car payment. But keep in mind, that's my life. I've been taught to work on cars, and so I can buy a car that might need a little bit of repairs and get away with it. You may not be able to do that, so I'm not trying to tell you what to do with that. But I want you just to get that point, that the way we use our money tells us what's important to us. And so you've heard a little bit about what's important to me and Katie. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to honor the Lord with our wealth, with our money? In Solomon's day, there wasn't a question. This wasn't something we're like, oh, we need to have a long debate about this. No, just read the Old Testament. It tells you what to do with your money. Right? The second statement is that we are to honor the Lord with the first fruits of all their produce, right? I don't have any produce. I mean, we had like a grape tomato plant, and so, I mean, I could give God like 7 tomatoes, and I would be applying that. But for people that were farmers in agricultural society, that meant that they were giving God the first fruits that came out of the ground. So when the harvest comes up, something comes up first. Well, it says give God that. Not the rotten ones, the good ones. It's the first of a harvest. But that's a very small part of what the people Solomon was writing to needed to do with their money. And some of you have heard of this idea of something called tithing. And so these people under the law had a lot of things that God specifically told them to do. All they needed to do was get out their calculator and do it. It's a little bit different for us today. I'll explain that. They're under the law. We are under grace. And so I'll say this up front, just so you guys know where I'm at. I don't believe that we're under the law. You may. I think you're wrong. We're not under the law. And so if we're going to pretend like we're under the law, then we really need to be under the law, right? So if you're going to say you're tithing, well, then let's actually do that, right? Let's tithe like they did in the Old Testament. Let's not just take one type of tithe and say, well, I'm doing that and I'm living out. No. I don't know how people get there. I don't know how pastors get there. I don't know how Christians get there, because when we look in the Old Testament, there were 3 types of tithes, and they didn't get to pick which one they wanted to give. They had to give all 3. So the Levitical tithe was the 10% tithe. That's the one that people think that we just carry that forward into the new covenant. And so that tithe was 10% of your income that went to the Levites, the people working in the temple, because they didn't have a land inheritance, and then you gave it to them so that they could eat. Right? There's a good principle there. But it's not a law that we are under. The next tithe was called like a festival or ceremonial tithe, and you put aside 10% in addition. So now we're at 20%. You want to tithe? Tithe. But that's not what I think we're called to do. And then the third one was the poverty tithe or the poor tithe, and that was every 3 years you gave 10%. So Anybody can do math in here where if you do 10% divided by 3, that's 3.333 repeater, put the little line above it, right? So we're at 23.3% that you would give on average annually to say you tithe. And you would give a first fruits offering. And you would give free will offerings. And so, if you want to tithe, tithe. But don't say you're tithing unless you're tithing. Malachi chapter 3, verse 8 says this. It says that for them, if they don't give their tithes, they don't bring their whole tithe into the storehouse, they are robbing God. And so that's something that's been said a lot in churches. And you might ask yourself, and this is something I ask myself, well, why would God set up a system of resources like this? Like, it seems a lot more efficient for God just to say, okay, well, I'm going to require 20 or 20 more percent from you back. Why wouldn't you just give you 80%? Like, just withhold it. You know, like a lot of us, when we have to pay our taxes, we have them withhold our taxes so that at the end of the year, we're not like, oh my gosh, I got to pay all this thousands of dollars to the government. Why wouldn't God just do it like that? Well, the answer, I believe, is found in the verses that come before our verse for today. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight, or he will direct your paths. God is seeing if we're trustworthy because we are stewards. There's a story I think that's very, very instructive in 1 Samuel chapter 2. What we find is that there are these priests that were the recipients of the Levitical tithe. And so what we're told in the Bible is that they were given 10% from the people, and then they were to give 10% to the Lord. So they tithed on the tithe. But the guy's name in that passage is Eli. And Eli has some sons. And Eli wasn't doing the right thing. Eli wasn't tithing on the tithe. And so what happens is God sends a messenger, a man of God, to Eli and says, Eli, why are you honoring your sons instead of honoring God? It's the same word that we find in the Ten Commandments, the same honor word. He says, why are you doing that? He says, because you chose to honor your sons above honoring God. You chose to give your sons the portion that was supposed to go to God. God is taking away your priesthood. They were robbing God. God took it very seriously. So we ask ourselves, well, what's the principle here? Well, the principle here is that God holds us accountable as stewards. You guys heard that text? You guys heard, well, I can't wait to hear, well done, good and faithful servant? You guys heard that before? That's talking about being a good steward. And so Johnny Hunt is someone I was at a conference a couple weeks ago, and he says, too many Christians expect to hear, well done, good and faithful servant, when they haven't done well. Like, it's not just a given that you're going to hear, well done, unless you do well. You might get into heaven, but you're not going to hear that statement. But I think there's something else in there. Eli had a temptation that I think we in America deal with. Eli chose to honor his sons above honoring God. And I think sometimes, dare I say, we might do that with our children. We say, well, you know, my kids need this, and they need that, and, you know, they want to play travel sports, and maybe they're going to get a scholarship, so I'm going to pay $1,000 a month for them to be in this, and this, and this, and this. And yet you're like, well, God, I only got $20 left, here you go. And we say, why are you honoring your children over honoring God? We got our priorities out of order. So maybe that's not the case for you, so we'll just keep moving. Look at verse 10 of Proverbs chapter 3. He says, honor the Lord with your wealth, the first fruits of your produce. Then he says, then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. Now, I like this promise. So it means that if I live in Columbia, I live in a townhouse, that if I start doing this, a barn is going to pop up in my parking lot, and I'm about to open a winery, and it's about to be really successful. That's what this says. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do we interpret that? Because it hasn't happened for me. I believe that I am seeking to honor the Lord with my wealth, and I don't have a barn that popped up. I'd love a barn, and I'd love a winery. It'd be pretty cool. It'd be a source of income, but I don't have that. So how do we interpret this text? Well, the plain reading, the principle here is that if you honor God with your wealth, then he will bless you. Malachi 3:10 says that if you bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, then God will bless you with a good portion running over. Somewhere it says it like that. And so what we have to ask ourselves is, has anything changed since Malachi chapter 3, since Proverbs 3:10? What has changed between then and now? And so we are in, today's the first day of Advent. And so if we are getting ready to celebrate Christmas, Christmas is about Jesus' coming. And so what has changed in this whole system is that Jesus has come. And so in the old covenant, before Christ, you honored God with your wealth, God blessed you. And that blessing was meant, they would understand that to be a material blessing. That's what they would have expected. But now that Jesus has come, there's been a change. If you look at Ephesians chapter 1, verse 3, it says this: "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us." Past tense, he has blessed us in Christ with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. In the old covenant, you gave so that God would bless you. In the new covenant, we give because God has already blessed us. Second thing I want you to see today is just that in a different way. We don't give to get, we get to give. We don't give to get, we get to give. We don't give so that God's going to give it back, we get to give. We are not under the law. You say, well, it says he has blessed us with every spiritual. What does that mean? How has God blessed me? I don't think God's blessed me. You know, I could use an extra $10,000 in income this year. Well, let me tell you some blessings that don't involve money. Has God given you eternal life? Has he delivered you from the bondage of sin? Has he brought you into a church family that cares for you? You know, we could go on and on. Like what has God done in your life that is far more valuable than money? You can't take it with you anyways. But what if this was simply a transaction? What if I came up here and said, hey guys, if you give God 10% of your income, I promise he's going to give you back 15. You know what? This place would be, if I could pull that off, I would run out of money pretty quick. But if I could pull that off, man, this place would be full. We would knock down, I could probably build a church as big as the entire city of Columbia. Because you know that's a better return than most of our retirement accounts. 5%? If I could promise you that, hey, come in here, give God 10%, he'll give you back 15. You don't have to be a Christian to do that. Like, in fact, if you're not a Christian, you're very likely to do that. Man, we'll have some drug dealers in here. They'll be like, man, this is better than selling drugs. I don't have to even do any of that stuff. I don't have to go to jail. I can just give this to God, and he's going to give me back. You know, next week we're beginning a series next week called Generosity Unleashed. And one of the things I'm going to talk about in the sermon next week is that how contentment, and you'll hear it the week after that too, contentment is a greater blessing than this incessant need that we have for more. And I'll tell you a story next week, but I was talking to a guy my age who's trying to get a record deal, and he's looking for $1 million record deal, and he's close to getting it. I said, well, what do you do when you get to $1 million? He's like, well, then I want more than it. I want like 10 million. And like, this is a guy that actually, most of you probably can't get that, but he's probably going to get that. He says, well, I want more. And then I want more. And then I want more. And he understands that, yeah, I'm never, this thirst I have for more is never going to be satisfied. That's a horrible way to live. It's a horrible way to live. You can't enjoy life now because you are only thinking about what you need later. But if it's true that we're not under the law, maybe you've come in here today and you're like, man, I've never heard anybody say this before. You know, I've read that, I tried to study like the history of, I have a book that somebody's doctoral dissertation from seminary on tithing. And it goes through the history of tithing all the way from the early church till now. Man, one of the reasons that tithing has been taught is because a lot of pastors realize that we're not under tithing, but they realize if we don't teach tithing, then we won't have any money. And I think that's horrible. Because I know I have to answer to God for what I say to you, so I hope to say to you the truth, whether or not it affects our bottom line at church. But let me tell you what comes next, because I think if we understand this correctly, our bottom line won't be affected at all. And so how are we to honor God with our money under the new covenant? We're not under tithing. We are in the post-tithe era, we could call it. And so what I want you to see, third thing, is that only God can tell you what to give. Only God can tell you what to give. I can't stand up here and tell you how much to give. Only God can do that. It'd be much easier if I could. Get out your calculator, put in your income, gross or net, we can have that conversation, put it in there, give it to God, sit down. I don't even need to preach a sermon. In the new covenant, we figure out how much we are to give by getting on our knees before God and asking Him how much He wants us to give. This is not something that many of us are good at, seeking the will of God on an issue. Most of us are like, man, just tell me what percentage to give. I'll do it. Maybe you won't do it, but at least you'll say you'll do it. But you don't want to get on your knees before God and ask Him, hey, what do you want for me? What would be honoring given my situation in life? You know, and for Christians that say, well, I'm tithing, man. If everybody just tithed, would be good. Listen, what you mean by that is you're giving 10%. And so if you want to be under the law, be under the law. 23.3% plus free will offerings. Go ahead, do that. But until you're going to do that, be quiet. But I'm going to share you a quote from John Piper, much older man than me, and so let me just tell you what he says, and you can get mad at him, send him an email. His email's online. It says, my own conviction is that most middle and upper class Americans who merely tithe are robbing God. Do you hear that? My own conviction is that most middle and upper class Americans who merely tithe are robbing God. It says most, doesn't say all. Understanding that most of us do have wealth, according to the definition of wealth, that we have enough to live comfortably. And so I think that points to this idea that we're asking the wrong questions. We ask, how much do I have to give? So we ask. What if we start asking a different question? What if we start asking, how much can I give? Or how much do I need to keep? You know, what if we start asking those questions? Because if we ask those questions, I believe we'll come out with a different solution. You know, this is about honoring God. We talked in the beginning, I showed you the video from Alfred Rascon, who was worthy of honor and didn't get it because someone lost the paperwork. Listen, you're in this room right now, you haven't lost the paperwork on what God has done. We talk about what God has done every Sunday. There's never a Sunday where we preach and we don't open the Bible. The Bible is your paperwork on what God has done. And so we respond to that by honoring. And yet the statistics say that the average American Christian gives less than 3% of their income annually. And I have a really hard time. Maybe you'll disagree with me, and that's okay. I have a really hard time believing that statistic results from Christians getting on their knees before God and saying, God, how much do you want me to give? And God says, 2.3%. Maybe somebody. But everybody, hard time believing that. I think the clearest text on giving in the New Testament is this, 2 Corinthians 9:7. It says, each one, this is Paul speaking, to the church at Corinth, each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Other texts tell us that we are to give sacrificially and that we are to give regularly. And I'm aware that it's a lot easier for me just to say, hey, give God 10%. That's what's honoring him. And maybe that is what's honoring him for you, but you got to ask God that. And so last year, we talked about this, and we talked about, okay, well, if this is that difficult, right? Most of us don't get on our knees to ask God anything. We maybe say, God, can you, like we don't actually expect an answer. Let me say that. We ask God lots of things. God, can you bless my mom, my dad, all this stuff. But we go to him and say, God, I need direction. And most of us don't do that. And so what we wanted to do last year was create a tool for you to be able to do that. For you to be able to sit down before God and say, God, I don't know where to go. I don't know how to do this. And so in your bulletin, you have something called a Next Steps Giving worksheet. And so I'm providing this for you because I want you to be able to honor God with your wealth, with your income. I don't want you to be deceived into thinking that there's just some formula that you can apply and that's what you're supposed to do. No. You need to sit down before God. But sometime between now and the end of the year and determine, God, what do you want me to give next year? So this is a way that you can do that. And, this is about your heart. Let me tell you why I started giving. I started giving 10% of my income because I was told that if I don't do that, then I'm robbing God. So it got me to the right place, but it got me there for the wrong reason. It got me there because of fear, not because of my heart. Does that make sense? Like, I'm glad that I started giving. And when I started giving out of fear of robbing God, my heart turned to the right thing. But just because that worked for me doesn't mean I can do that to you, because I don't think that was the right thing to do. And so this is a different way to get at that amount. And I think this is something that if you did it last year, that you should do annually. We'll do it again next year, because our situation's changed from year to year. And here's the thing. Most of us aren't thinking about this on a regular basis because it's not something we like to think about. But it's something that if we want to honor God, we do need to think about. And so the first next step there is this: calculate your giving percentage. And so this assumes that you actually know what you're giving. So if you're the kind of person that comes to church on Sunday, haven't thought about what you're giving, you just reach in your wallet and, oh, there's a $5, oh, there's a $50 bill, you drop it in there, you don't remember, there's no way for you to figure this out. And so the challenge would be to, if you don't know, if you haven't been giving regularly over this past year and you don't know, well, this is how much I give every week, to try and figure that out. What am I giving? Because it's important that you know. It's important that you know, because if God asks you, have you been a good steward, you're like, well, I guess. I don't know. I just gave whatever's in my pocket. Like, God's like, oh, you put your credit card in there? No, I didn't put my credit card in there. Oh, you put the change that you have for like a sweet tea at McDonald's. Oh, got it. So calculate this. So, math problem. You make $10, you give $1. What's that percentage? 10%. You make $100, you give $10. What's that percentage? 10%. You make $1,000, you give $500. What's that percentage? 50%, right? I don't know what your numbers are. Put them there. The point of this is just to open your eyes to whether or not you're being a good steward, because God's going to ask you. It's not about me. You don't have to answer to me. You answer to God about how you're doing at stewarding his resources. So you can put those down. You write down those things. You may not know those now. You may need to go do some digging. If you write checks, it's a lot easier to figure out. If you give online, it's really easy to figure out. If you give cash, unless you put them in an envelope, it's going to be kind of hard to figure out. And so if you want to be able to track this for the rest of the year, there's envelopes that you can put your money in so that we can track it for you. Next step B is to compare that percentage to other categories. And so just personally speaking, this is a conviction that Katie and I have. The only thing that we want as a rule to be over our giving to the Lord is our mortgage. And so what that means is that God's got to give me a lot of money, and God knows this. God, if you want me to drive a Mercedes, you got to give me a lot of money. Because for me to make that car payment, that means I'm going to give more than that to you. Then I need you got to just pour it out. You got to pour out blessings on me, because unless that, in my mind, I can't afford it. It's a conviction that I have. So I've done this, talked about it with my wife, and we've come to a conclusion about we are on the same page. We know what it looks like. And so my challenge for you, this is something they talk about in Financial Peace University, is you should be able to talk to your spouse about your finances in general, but you should also be able to talk about what you're giving and to pray about it together. So could be a really cool time for you to grow closer in your marriage. So after you do that, that's just information finding. Next step C is this. Ask if this reflects what you want your heart to treasure. Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I love that text because it tells me that what I do with my money directs my heart. Do you know that? What you do with your money directs your heart. So if you want to care about God and be passionate about God, then your money will direct that. If you don't want that, then put it somewhere else. If you want to only care about your car or whatever it is, then put it there. You want to care about some organization, another different organization, put your money there. Your heart will be there. May not be a bad thing. But if you want your heart to treasure God, then your money has to flow in that direction. And so some of you will see that your giving is like the seventh thing on the rank, or maybe it's the last thing on the rank. Maybe your Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks is greater than your giving to the Lord. And you'll be like, I ain't going to hear well done, good and faithful servant. Not today. And so maybe you make some adjustments. Some of you want to give. And you're going to grieve when you do this because you've made some decisions. You haven't been disciplined in your spending, and so you're in a lot of debt. Some of you have $15,000 of credit card debt, college loans, all this stuff, car payments, all your money's accounted for. You have no free say in your income. And you're going to grieve. God, I want to be a good steward, but I've made decisions over the last 10 years of my life that have keep me from being able to give anything of significance to you. I'm giving all my money in interest. And so if that's you, there's things that can help you. One of those is called Financial Peace University. We've offered this the last 2 years. We don't have one scheduled for January, but usually when we do a sermon like this, a lot of you say, hey, that's me, and then we offer it. Because we know that. So if you're sitting here today and you're like, man, you go through this week, next week, on your Connect card, if you write on the comments, I need FPU. It's $100. It's a class you go through. We don't get it. It's just for your study guide. And you will learn how to get out of debt so that you can learn to honor God with your wealth, but also just be a steward in general so that when you go to heaven, you can hear, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your master. And so you can write that down, and we will hopefully have enough of you that we, I think, let me just say this, if we're honest, there's enough of you that need that class. If we're not, maybe only a couple of you would admit it, but I hope that all of you would and set aside the time to go. And then lastly, spend time with God to determine the amount He would have you commit to give in 2019. Something, this is just me being mentored by others, something that other pastors have taught me is that it's a good thing to try and increase your giving every year because God usually increases your income every year. Most people's jobs increase their income. Not everybody's, but most of us in America, our incomes go up. And so the challenge to, if you have more income doesn't mean you have more needs. And so to increase your giving in proportion with your income or even more than. And so that's something Katie and I try to do every year. And maybe you're here today and you're giving 2%. Maybe you're giving 1%. Maybe you're giving 0.1% of your income to the Lord. Maybe you're making a lot of money and you're giving the Lord $20. Well, sit down with Him. Go through some texts on giving. Let me give you some. 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. The story of the widow's mite in Mark chapter 12. The rich young ruler in Luke. The parable of the talents in Matthew chapter 25. Take those texts, read them, journal them maybe, and say, God, what do you want me to give in 2019? This past year, I gave 2%. I know that's not what I want to give. I want to get to this. But I can't do that unless I go into debt. So God, here's my plan. Tell me what you think about it. Next year, I'm going to give 3%. The year after that, I'm going to give 4%. And then next year, you can reevaluate that. Maybe God will bless you and you won't have to go through that plan. But you say, God, what do you want me to do? And this is why we give this to you. We don't give this to you so that you are like, oh man, the church wants my money. No, listen. I want you to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. We're doing all right on our budget right now. It's nice to preach about money when people don't have to think it's because we need money. We could use the money. Let's not be wrong. We could use it. But this sermon is about you and your heart, you directing your heart, and you honoring God with your wealth. For me, once I know that percentage, I go in and I go into the online giving and I adjust it so it's regular, because I know that if I wait until the end of the time, end of the pay period, whether that's weekly or bi-weekly or whatever it is for you, there'll be nothing left. So I know I get paid on Friday, well, it comes out on Friday. I don't need to be spiritual to that. That's just because I can't manage my money well enough to keep it. Right? I don't need a biblical principle to do that. We could say it's first fruits, but we don't have to say that. Just say you can't manage your money, so you need to take it first. That's the situation most of us are in. But I think something that will really help us just grasp this is what we're going to end with, the Lord's Supper. You know, the Lord's Supper is a time where we remember that Jesus sacrificed for us in a great way. You know, it would be crazy to say Jesus just tithed on the cross. Jesus gave everything on the cross. And so as we reflect on the sacrifice that he made, it helps to put the sacrifice that he asks us to make in perspective. Jesus, you gave everything for me. Whatever you want me to give, I will give. Maybe you're the rich young ruler here and he says you need to give everything. Maybe you're not. But you ask God and you say, God, I'll be obedient to whatever it is. So I want to invite the worship team up and the deacons forward to come and distribute the elements. And these